Welcome to all. This is Doug Jury speaking. I think for this morning's or this afternoon or this evening session, we have about 10 time zones involved today. So I have to say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We see as people start to trickle in, I'm going to go ahead and kick this off, and hopefully people will be coming in as well soon after. In the next hour, we're going to hear about a transformational use case from an industry leader at Ancestry. He's changed the entire way he's done business. So to start with, I'm Doug Jury, the VP of Product and Partner Marketing, and I'm going to be your flight attendant today. I've been here since the start of Zadara, and I've only seen a couple of use cases that have transformed business like this one. This is a really exciting use case that we're going to talk about. Nolan Flukiger, our senior system admin at Ancestry, is going to take us through his story. And like I said, I met Nolan about 3 years ago, and we've just made this story even better as we've changed things out. And we're also going to have Henry Baltazar. He's going to discuss the ongoing industry numbers and so forth. As an engineer, I love numbers. I love statistics. Henry, a research director at 451, has it all. So very, very cool what we're going to see here in the next 60 minutes. So on the next slide, we're going to see the agenda, and I'm going to take you through a few of the slides on Zadara and what we do. Maybe some of you haven't heard about Zadara, so I'm just going to take you through a little bit, but I think you really want to hear from Henry and Nolan for the most part. Then on to Henry. He's going to do an amazing view of the storage industry, the cloud, where things are headed. And like I said, I love to hear 451 and Henry get in front of us with all this kind of information. Nolan's going to share the Ancestry story and how he has amazingly moved the business 100% to the cloud by keeping the business running. And that is such a key attribute of a successful transformation. Then what we're going to do is we're going to open up to some Q&A. We're going to have a panel discussion at the end where Henry and Nolan are going to kind of, just for you, imagine that they're on the stage and you're in a nice big hall, and they're going to have a conversation at the end. But we'll also take some questions along the way here. I can answer some of those online. I can bring those up as we move forward. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and take you a little bit through Zadara. So Zadara, enterprise storage as a service. And as you probably know, people have built up what I call these silos of storage. They have the best in breed for NetApp, using NetApp perhaps for NAS. They do best in breed maybe for HP, for Block, or EMC. There's lots of different silos out there. And what we decided to do back when our genesis back in 2011 was to come out with an environment that would support the block, file, and object in one particular device. Fiber channel, iSCSI, NFS SIFs, S3 Swift, all the various protocols that you need, not having to buy 3 or 4 different silos. And then where do you put it? You put it in on-prem, you put it in the public or private cloud, you have the two talk up and down. And I like to use the term common set of tools, technologies, and techniques. So we're going to basically show you how that has helped Nolan out as well. Next slide. So we look at the demand to the, the usage, if you will. Where do we put the equipment, or where do we need the location to be? And what is the demand that's on us? So if we look at the bottom here, we have big data analytics and DevOps and field sales and remote offices. You can read all those. And the first layer up is really the Zadara virtual private storage. And that is broken into our block and our file on the left called VPSA. And then off to the right, we have our virtual private object storage. So in one array, we can basically do NAS, we can do block, we can do object storage, and all the resources basically can be used for whatever needs you have. Now, that tier itself can't solve all the business problems, of course. We need to have backup and DR, highly available systems. We need to be able to support with VMware. And we do this either through inherent products and features that are built right inside the array, or we partner with tremendous companies to be able to solve that. And then up on the top, where are we going to present this? So we're going to basically put this maybe on premises, maybe in a service provider or an MSP here, maybe through a hypercloud, through an Amazon or an Azure or Google or people like that. So basically, the demand on the bottom through some really cool technology to bringing it to it. And Nolan's going to talk about his Amazon environment when we get there. Next. So when we designed the company, the genesis was we want to do enterprise grade performance and security. We want to have it agile and only pay for what you use and pay as you go, completely OpEx model, and fully managed to basically augment your IT departments and your IT staff. So you can go off and do other things that are important to you, basically. So you don't give up anything on the enterprise grade features. You basically only pay for what you use, and we can help you out with our 24/7 management and upgrades and all the other pieces there. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Henry. Henry, the world is yours.
Thanks so much, Doug, and thank you all for joining me today on this. I've been covering storage for the better part of 20 years, and quite frankly, I think this is probably, it keeps getting worse. I think in terms of the challenges ahead, the challenges that infrastructure professionals need to face, that burden just gets harder and harder year after year. Next slide, please. And the reason is there's a lot of demands that are being placed on us today. Those of us that are storage professionals or infrastructure professionals that have to service our clients. I mean, there's the problem is not only is the biggest problem is the burden of storage continues to grow because most businesses or almost all businesses are seeing a lot of data growth. In some cases, we see 20% data growth from some organizations. In other cases, it could be even higher than 40%, depending on the type of organizations and what type of businesses they're running. And the biggest thing about that is as that data continues to grow, all of these other problems become much more harder to solve, which is the key thing we have to keep in mind as we start looking at these environments. When I look at this, it really shows that if we don't transform our storage today, there's a really good chance we're going to get overrun by these burdens. So what I recommend to my customers and what I recommend even to the vendors that are trying to sell these products is we need to make sure we're finding better ways and more innovative ways of delivering storage, but while keeping in mind some of these key pain points. One of the top pain points and one of the biggest issues we've heard about in the last couple of years has been disaster recovery. The need for disaster recovery, both from a compliance standpoint and also from a business continuity standpoint. That continues to be a huge problem, and it's actually a big area for why people are looking at cloud today, because one of the advantages of going to cloud for disaster recovery is the fact that you don't have to worry about buying additional gear, you have to worry about running an additional site, or even having talented professionals to manage those other sites. That's one of the beautiful benefits of cloud, and a big reason why disaster recovery has been a big use case going forward. Another key thing that organizations are struggling with is performance, and performance is not a single thing either. It's not just about top line performance in terms of transactions per second and things like that. Some organizations are more concerned about throughput per second. If you're talking about the video industry, or if you're talking about some analytics, they want to have high throughput. In some cases, really the biggest case where we see a lot of people complaining about performance isn't about those metrics. It's actually about how do I deliver performance consistency. And that's really a key area where on-premises infrastructure struggles to be able to get to that. So it's been something that organizations want to get better at in terms of making sure the performance they have in their systems are divvied up in the right way going forward. I think another key issue is also compliance, and that also includes things like encryption and how you protect your data at rest, how you protect your data as it's in flight. Compliance continues to be a big area of concern, and it's something that organizations want to have help with. And finally, from a cost perspective, a lot of the organizations are complaining about high CapEx costs. They're trying to get off the age-old models that we've been using before, which is typically in the storage space, you buy an array and you wind up holding that array for 3 to 5 years. A lot of organizations want to get out of that and want to get to more fluid type of models where they can expand or contract their uses of storage when they need to. Next slide, please. When I look at when I talk to customers, one of the key things we ask about at the beginning here is asking about budgets and what's going on with, especially their on-prem storage budgets. And in the last survey we had there, about 25% of the respondents said that they were expecting to decline their spending on on-premises storage in 2020, with another 6% saying it's flat. Those declines actually got worse for organizations that were larger. When we looked at the organizations that were 1,000 plus, that went up to from 25% to 30% in terms of declining storage budgets. And when we asked these organizations, what's the main reason for the decline in storage budgets, the top reason was they admitted that it was because they're shifting their spend to public cloud. That was what the organization decided to do. And 59% of respondents said it was because of that. Another 16% said that the reason why they were cutting the budget was because of overall IT spending cuts and constraints, which is common, continues to be something we hear about when we talk to organizations. And another, on the bright side, there was 16% who said that they were able to cut their spend on storage and other infrastructure components because they were able to take advantage of new technologies. So whether that be deduplication, convergence, in some cases, shift from going from expensive file storage to something cheaper like object storage, those type of shifts are the things that help us try to contain these costs and make sure that we're prepared to go forward with these larger and larger data silos and these higher and higher expectations in terms of customer expectations for performance and all these other types of capabilities. And only 3% of the people in the survey said that it was because of overall business decline being the reason why they're cutting down their budgets. Next slide, please. When we look at where we are today, right now, about 29% said, or a big chunk said, they favored capital expenditures or CapEx for their storage purchases or infrastructure purchases, in contrast to about 20% on the OpEx side for that. Well, but looking at what's going to happen in the next 3 years, those things are going to flip around, with CapEx going down to about 19% and the OpEx, the people that favor OpEx going about to 31%. That's not to say that it's going to be all or nothing type of thing. You still have a fair amount of organizations that are going to do a mix of CapEx and OpEx. That's about 38% today, going to 30% in about 2 years. But I think what concerns me more, and the thing that really shocked me, was we have a lot of people that are still going to be unsure of what's going to happen in 3 years. So as we look at this, it's definitely a fluid situation. The signs are showing that, and from the organizations that we talked to, it seems like there's going to be much more favor towards OpEx going forward, mostly because of the flexibility, and also, especially in these times today, when I speak to a lot of organizations, a lot of their concerns are about how they can conserve cash while still being able to continue to deliver the right levels of performance, capacity, and all the other capabilities you have associated with storage. Next slide. Next slide, we're going to be talking about where we are with cloud storage today and how organizations are using it. Next slide. When we look at cloud storage, not a big surprise. A lot of things that moved early, especially with COVID and a lot of people working from home. There was a lot of employee productivity workloads that were moving to the cloud as a result of what's been going on there, and as a result of ongoing trends going forward. The other thing that we're starting to see is with some of the emerging use cases, like some of the IoT archiving and other these next generation use cases, a lot of them are starting to look at using the cloud for archiving going forward. So we expect to see a lot of these new businesses starting to leverage cloud in that manner. What more closer to home in terms of the on-prem enterprise side, we see a lot of adoption in terms of secondary storage use cases for cloud storage. The majority of people, well, 61% are already using cloud-based data protection within their environments, and the percentage of people that are using it for archiving is even higher. 74% of the people we surveyed said they were using cloud for archiving today. Next slide. Let's dive a little bit deeper into these numbers. When we look at the numbers, as you would expect, for large organizations that have over a petabyte of storage or data under management, you still have about 42% of them are keeping everything on-prem. These tend to be a lot of the conservative type organizations, a lot of organizations that are having difficulty moving all of this to cloud. So I wasn't too surprised to see that. But if you look at these numbers here, it's still the minority. People that only do on-prem, which is that green bar, it's only 38 or 39% or so of respondents are only doing on-prem. The majority of organizations are doing some form of cloud, whether it be the 40% that are doing it in a hybrid format, which is typically having local backup for fast recoveries while using the long-term retention in the cloud or long-term recovery in the cloud. And so that being one of the big hybrid use cases. And we still had another 21% of organizations that were going to a straight SaaS model, so doing online backup or doing DRaaS, or disaster recovery as a service, as their primary way of doing cloud data protection. Next slide. Turning to the archiving side. On the archiving side, we still don't have a lot of, there are still organizations that are not going to use archiving. There's still 26% or so who said that they're not doing any of their data in the cloud at all right now. But when we look here, the majority of people are doing some sort of cloud archiving today. I expect this to expand as things go forward. I think a lot of the organizations today on the archiving side are still very much focused on compliance and a lot of things like emails and things like that that are linked to a compliance specific application or cloud. But as we start going forward and as we start seeing larger and larger files, I expect to see more of those being pushed into the archiving for cloud, just based on the conversations we've had and the trajectory we've been seeing going on with these types of technologies, especially on the object storage side. Next slide. The other thing that we're keeping an eye on is what's the impact of COVID-19 and how is that changing what we're doing in the organizations. For the most part, we still had 48% of organizations that said they're going to continue on the original timeline. I talked to large financial services type customers, and even though there is opportunities to use cloud, they're still not going to move everything to cloud because they still have the same concerns that they had from the past in terms of maybe it's a security compliance type of issue, or maybe it's a locality issue, which is why they didn't move. So for some of those organizations, they're still chugging away on their original timeline. We do see some accelerated use of cloud for some organizations as well, because in some areas, cloud has been the ability to use cloud storage has been a great a way to augment our capacity and the resources we have. Because it's not as easy these days with social distancing and those types of restrictions. It's not so easy these days to be able to get a new system, get it implemented and up and running as quickly as possible, the way that we normally would have been able to do these things. I think as a result of that, that's why we're starting to see more organizations potentially using cloud to be able to deal with these issues, because at the end of the day, nobody wants to throw away data. Data is super valuable for everybody, so they can't afford to throw away the data. And we need to be smarter about what we could do and find new ways to store that data if we don't have the on-prem resources. Next slide. Now let's go on to the ongoing challenges. Next slide. Well, while cloud storage is definitely a very interesting technology and something that's been evolving very rapidly over the last decade or so, when we ask organizations who are using cloud today, they do see areas where there is room for improvement. In particular, in terms of performance, we had 30% of respondents who said they wanted to have higher performance, and they wanted to have higher performance options compared to what they're getting from their standard hyperscaler type cloud storage offerings today. So performance was still an issue for some of them, and in some cases I've seen situations where the performance wasn't good enough and they wound up having to bring an application back because of that. Another key issue and another key area that we hear a lot of complaints about is the need for improved technical support. 25% of the respondents today said that they wanted to have better technical support from their cloud service providers, especially guidance and troubleshooting, to make sure they're using the right type of resources and making sure they're architecting things the right way so that they don't have issues with the resources, the cloud storage resources not being able to keep up with the application's workload. And I think we'll see some of this in Nolan's presentation as well, but there's definitely room for improvement here, and I think that's why there's a room for new innovators to come into play, delivering different services that have these higher levels of performance and support. A last area, and definitely a key thing to keep in mind, is application compatibility. We still had 23% of respondents complaining about that, even though a lot of the cloud storage providers today do have key capabilities like standard protocol support for things like CIFS and NFS. There are gaps in some of these types of services, which we'll be talking about very shortly when Nolan starts his presentation. When I look at this, application compatibility is going to continue to be a key issue going forward, because a lot of us can't afford to just rewrite our applications to make them work. So we need to find better ways of making sure we're running these things correctly, and making sure that whatever cloud services we have are comparable in terms of the compatibility capabilities compared to what we were already doing on-prem. Next slide. And another key thing to keep in mind, and an issue that'll continue to be a big issue going forward, is how we move data to cloud. And the majority of people are still moving data over network transport. We had 48% of respondents said that was the primary way of doing that, which is going to put a premium on key technologies such as compression, deduplication, and anything we can do to reduce the number of bits that go over across the wire. The use of physical transport, things like a provider-enabled physical transport, things like AWS Snowball, that's up to about 18% right now in terms of respondents using that. And we still do have a number of organizations that are using things like tapes or shipping arrays to provide us to do that type of data migration as well. But when I look at this, it's clear that because the majority of the data movements going forward are going to be on the network transport, we need to be more efficient about that, and also deal with the security of how we move these things from on-prem to a cloud environment going forward. With that, next slide. With that, I'm going to be kicking things over to Nolan.
So thank you so much, Henry, for that. That was just fabulous information. I love going through the data. Like I said, kind of an engineering-minded person. I look at cloud transformation and transformation of data and so forth, and someday we'll look up in a wiki, and the word cloud transformation will have an equal sign, and there'll be Ancestry. I mean, cloud transformation is a concept, and now what we're going to do with Nolan and his information here is we're going to see this concept be brought into action. He's transformed his business from top to bottom of how he's effectively running the business that it used to be, far west in Utah, now in the data center in AWS and Zadara on the East Coast. So Nolan, take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you, Henry and Doug. We'll hop over to the next slide. Thank you. Basically, most people are quite familiar with Ancestry. Ancestry offers a number of products to explore your past, your ancestors, obviously, DNA to start to create additional ties or connections, and it's evolving and moving towards even preventative health, and so it's really an exciting place to be involved. And in the next slide, we'll talk a bit about the Emerging Business Division. The Emerging Business Division provides ancillary products and services that complement the core offerings. A couple of things that may not seem relevant is there's a culture of empowerment, and we work very closely together. Just to give kind of a visual, for example, when I came on, we had the 4 sysadmins, the emerging business IT team, all in the same room where we collaborate closely, where knowledge is shared, and where we are able to learn from one another's findings and learnings. And that's been a real help to me as we've gone through a lot of these transitions, where they were able to share their knowledge and context. That extends out to development teams we help support, and the personnel that we also support, where there's a type feedback loop where we're able to iterate quickly and be very responsive. And that was a key principle. And again, we're focused on lean principles as noted. Some of the products and services that are offered through the Emerging Business Division are Fold3.com provides military records and collections and such. We Remember, it's basically where individuals can create memoriams, virtual memoriams or memorials to those who've passed on, where they can collaborate and share memories and have artifacts for future generations to be able to understand those who've come before. Find a Grave allows individuals to see pictures of tombstones or request pictures, and uses volunteers to help provide that. So it's a wonderful offering. Pro-genealogists for those who need professional services for research, and newspapers.com, which offers a very extensive collection of newspapers. And part of that, an earlier offering was iArchives, but that's basically it is used to generate internal content. That's the piece I help support primarily, and that generates content for newspapers.com off microfilm and other physical media, up to, at peak, 10 million images per month. And of course, that requires a lot of resources. Initially, we were in 2 data centers with over 1,000 servers and 4,000 plus hard drives and storage arrays. And of that, about 60% of those resources were used for the content generation. And in the next slide, just to kind of give a sense of that, our resources were in 2 data centers, both within about 20 miles of headquarters, so the latencies were fairly low, and we just had racks and racks of compute, storage, and other resources, I think in the ballpark of 65 racks. And so Ancestry, as is on public record, worked with the cloud provider and decided we're going to move everything to the cloud. And so that mandate also rolled down to the Emerging Business Division. And from when we firmly took that on to when we completed that, that took us about 1 year for the emerging business resources to make that full migration from when we made the firm determination we were going to do it to when we completed that. And let me just think a moment. and so our life at that point, maybe just a retrospective, the team of 4 admins, we were responsible for equipment from acquisition, purchase to decommission, including day-to-day issues, maintenance, replacing drives or fixing on-premise needed hardware that needed intervention. So we were quite busy where the amount of equipment we operated or maintained per admin was significant. If we cut over to the next slide, and we talked about this a bit, so let's move on to the next slide. Thank you. This, of course, to the left gives us a reiteration of some of the resources we maintained. But at this point, I'll give a little bit of a mental walkthrough of what we did within the newspaper content production pipeline, which was formerly the iArchives entity in emerging business. And so basically what we'd do is we'd receive shipments of microfilm from institutions, newspapers, or other institutions, government entities, or those type institutions. We'd receive the microfilm, and that microfilm we'd scan. You see the scanners in the diagram to the left. That microfilm, and if you can imagine a landscape picture on steroids, so about 100 or more images wide, these scanners would create this ribbon image. And the ribbon image would then be written to what we call RSD, which is a remote storage device, which was paired with the scanner. So at that point, the ribbon, each image was cropped and identified with a rough cropping, and then that ribbon was broken hundreds or thousands of raw images, consider them like a newspaper page or something like that, were extracted and uploaded to our storage in the data center represented by the production supermicro storage. We had about 400 terabytes of storage that we were using to support the specific scanning, ingest of images, and processing. At that point, the images are defined, cataloged, what publication is this, month, day, year, page, etc. And they go through a process which included creating image artifacts, a small artifact to be able to send to an international third party to make sure that the image was cropped and skewed and presented correctly. Then once we got that, the adjustments needed, the images would be cropped and skewed. Then another derivative image would be created where we'd send that to a third party, do a manual key entry, or key content for each page, like to be relevant, at which point we then OCR each image and then create a final derivative image, who's the right size for to be presented via newspapers.com or whatever entity, and we'd overlay the OCR and the other metadata in a combined artifact that was then searchable for users to be able to search and type in a keyword, bring up page, see where the word or word strings appeared on a page. So it's a very I/O intensive process. The images could range from 17 to 50 megabytes in size, and so there was a lot of data moving. So let's move on to the next slide. And so, like in a good project, we need to sit down and think about what we're going to do as we decide how we're going to move all this infrastructure to the cloud. And some of the challenges, of course, were we had to keep the train moving. People need to be able to continue to produce content. And we also needed to find ways that we keep costs roughly or aligned with what we were presently spending. And Other considerations we're looking at, okay, what contracts we have for data center, for internet connectivity, all these other accompanying contracts. Is there a reasonable or a good window or a natural window that we should shoot for? And that's where we came up with the target of about a year. And then we had to think through, when we're dealing with a code base that's been evolved and written and grown over 16 years, what would it take to get that to work in the cloud? And do we want to refactor that to where it's cloud native or optimized for cloud, or do we try and minimize resources or time by finding ways to minimize changes and, in essence, forklift that to the cloud? And we considered both, and we ended up going with the forklift approach, but there were some issues we had to work through to do that. Number one, of course, where it wasn't as cloud native, we need to reconstruct resources in the cloud, provisioning, DNS and other things to bridge the legacy to the cloud, so we could get interoperability between the data center and the cloud as we transitioned, and also to maintain services once we move to the cloud. The speed of light is a challenge. When you're dealing with 20 miles to copy files, latencies aren't much of an issue. But when you start looking at moving stuff from Utah to Virginia, and in this case via Oregon, because the primary connection between Utah and Virginia was utilized for copying a lot of core ancestry data across, we go from under 10 milliseconds up to 80 milliseconds in latencies, and that is a challenge. Moving the data from the RSD, the storage devices, again to the supermicro storage we had at the time. And we did find ways to work around that with concurrent file operations, moving multiple files at the same time versus single files, so we were able to overcome some of those challenges. We needed storage that could handle a lot of read and write operations. Each storage array, and we had 8 of them, 2 for each queue server, and we'll look at that a little more in a bit, had up to 2,400 concurrent file operations hitting it, and file reads, file writes of significant size, and so there were some real challenges there, finding something that would work. But the blocker that we hit was we could not find any cloud-native solutions that provided the ability for Windows servers. The Windows servers were what we scanned the images with and uploaded the images from to our storage, and then need to interoperate with our Linux processing nodes that use different protocol, NFS. And we needed that interoperability to not have to rewrite a lot of what we did. So on the next slide, as we worked through the things we could address, we iterated through and explored options. Cloud file services were provided in terms of feature set and costs, and what would minimize rewrites. And fortunately, we had a partner who was aware of our situation, became aware of a third-party solution that looked like it would meet our needs, that being Zadara. And in short, the high level is that we could customize our storage solution, define how much compute we needed, how much disk in terms of I/O, caching, if you use that or not, and we worked with a third party to an introduction was made to Zadara, where we were able to, at that point, begin more formal dialogue on how that would look. And so with that, I'll let Doug talk a bit about what their offerings include.
Perfect. Thanks, Milton, so much. So you've seen these icons of the Zadara, the VPSA, and I wanted to give you just a little bit of a view into what really that represents. And on on our original conversation way up front, we talked a little bit about enterprise class storage. And as Nolan was saying, enterprise class storage sometimes isn't available in the various permutations as was Nolan needed. He needed CIFS and NFS in parallel. He needed to have very, very predictable performance. He wanted to pay as he went, and he wanted to do these things. So if you look at this diagram right now, this is sort of the Zadara cloud, if you will. And up on top, we have our storage nodes and our cores, and then we have our disks. And then we basically have the VPSAs off to the side. So what this is showing is that we can create in the same hardware configuration or multi-tenant architecture, if you will, we can create a solid state drive VPSA. We can create a hard drive with cache. We can create hard drives. We can do all this on an isolated manner where each drive is isolated to that customer or use case, which was important for Nolan to get repeatable performance. The cores up on top are really your RAID engines or your RAID controllers, and those are dedicated to Ancestry as well. So here we are in a multi-tenant world, but Nolan has a single-tenant architecture. He has a single-tenant experience. So all these things. Now, a couple of things here. You know what RAID is, redundant array of independent disks. What we've done here is we've taken, we've created RAIN, a redundant array of independent nodes. So not only is this very high performance, and you can isolate to individual customers, but we also have redundancy and very high HA. So if a server was to fail, we fail over to another storage node. If a core, if memory, if cache, if disks, this is highly available, but in that single tenant architecture. And that really is our single tenant experience. And that really is what our patent is all about when we do this. So you're going to see that VPSA pop up in the next slide, and Nolan's going to take us through the actual configuration of how these VPSAs became sort of paramount in his architecture of this continued transformation process. So Nolan, next slide.
Perfect. Thank you, Doug. And so as we look at the architecture here, it's exactly the same as it was, except in terms of layout and function, with the difference being that now we're uploading to the cloud. And again, we addressed that we had to do some work on that front to get concurrent file operations, concurrent copies running to address the speed of light issue. But our Supermicro storage was replaced by multiple Zadara VPSAs, virtual private storage arrays. And this was beautiful because, as noted, it required very little refactoring of code outside of the ability to upload across from Utah to Virginia. One item I somewhat overlooked is when we look at the processing nodes, of note, each of those processing nodes, we had 150 per queue for queue servers, so we, of course, were scaled horizontally with the 4 queue servers. Each of those processing nodes would run 4 concurrent processes, so we actually have a 4x load when we look at the number of processing nodes. So as we started working with Zadara, we, of course, had to iterate through, get things configured and set up. And as we move to the next slide, we'll talk about maybe some of the things we had to work through to get there. Zadara was great to work with. We set up a trial VPSA where we were able to test proof of concept. We were able to iterate through Zadara can handle NFS and CIFS together, but how do you configure that to have the interoperability, setting up permissions and rights, and so that as the processing goes back and forth, permissions are there to be able to interoperate as it's handed off from Windows to Linux, etc. And we were able to walk through each of the functions, uploading data from Utah to Virginia, Zadara, each of the various file operations, did they work, and then do our best to iterate through what is load going to look like. The challenge we faced is as data moves through the pipeline and it has a velocity of 10 to 14 days from scan to publication it takes a while to develop a full data set, and we iterated through each step in serial fashion. But in production, in reality, we have different data sets at different stages, and so we get a different mix of read-write performance that we weren't fully able to account for, or load would be another better way to put it, that we weren't able to fully account for until we actually got things into production. And so as we moved from our initial proposed VPSAs we worked with Doug and his team on, we found that we did require more IOPS, more read-write capability, and we were able to expand those SAS disks, the spinning disks, to manage our load. And in reality, like most things, it's a balance between performance and cost. We found something that worked good enough for us, so we were able to meet our daily sets. But the transition to the cloud did require that we have some personnel and operations shift around a bit so that we could reduce spikes. That did result in a lower quality of life for some time for a number of the individuals that manage workflow, the project managers, through the system. But that being said, we got to a point where we could maintain our full production with relative ease and stability, and we were able to successfully vacate our data centers by the target dates, including floor swept, lights out, and so we were able to minimize the period at which we were, the cloud migration cost period where we had dual costs of data center and the cloud. If we move on to the next slide, in short, we were able to move all of our compute, all our processing to the cloud, the exception being our RSD servers, the storage servers for the scanners, which were designed to be coupled close. Those we did move to the building here, but everything else we were able to migrate, and we had about 24 racks of dedicated newspaper scanning infrastructure. We were able to reduce that to under one, as noted, the RSDs we moved on site here. In aggregate, for all the emerging business resources that support all the complementary other systems, those were all fully moved to the cloud. So our data center footprint for emerging business, we reduced that over 98%. Over time, we have been able to reduce our costs in the cloud as we've been able to leverage other efficiencies like auto-scaling and such. And so for us, that has been huge. And the other thing we'd want to note is we have become more lean and efficient in our operations, which is a side effect or benefit of this. And as we've looked at that in retrospective and speaking with customers as to how it was 4 or 5 years ago versus now, users have noticed we have increased efficiencies and stability. In the next slide, we did move beyond the original VPSA. Doug and crew approached us, and they had newer offerings that involved flash arrays or SSD, and coupled with deduplication and compression. We don't use the deduplication where our content is unique, but the compression reduced the amount of physical storage we needed to the point where we were able to move to flash arrays. We now have better performance and with the same basic, a comparable cost. We are to the point now where we're able to reduce the manual intervention required and run more loads during peak business hours. It's improved the quality of life for our project managers, and we have very few issues related to the production pipeline. And if we move on to the next slide, some of the benefits we've had in moving to the cloud are, and I'll be brief here so we have time for Q&A. It's quicker to provision in the cloud, and we can try things very quickly. It goes from, oftentimes if you have to acquire hardware from months to minutes, literally. We have the ability to scale. We only pay for what we use. And a lot of our savings, I believe, when you own your infrastructure, you have to build for your peak loads. In the cloud, you're able to just pay for what you need as you need it. And that has more than offset the costs we incurred in the migration, and we anticipate realizing or having ongoing savings as a result of our having moved to the cloud. I'll also note that for us, the forklift approach worked very well for these systems, thanks to the ability of Zadara providing that missing component. And we've honestly had less issues with storage and such in the cloud. That's it for me, and I'll turn the time back over to Doug. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Nolan. You're not done yet, though. We have a few questions here. So I hope everybody enjoyed that. I mean, transforming your business from a small town in Utah to moving 70 terabytes a day over to the Amazon cloud, running on Zadara's enterprise storage, is no easy task, as you just saw. So the whole architecture here was really kind of a pride of Zadara's and a pride of Ancestry's to be able to really do what customers are asking the cloud to do today, and so forth. So I'm going to bring up Henry again. Henry, there's a few questions on the table here. If you'd like to kind of have a little bit of a panel discussion with Nolan, that would be perfect.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks so much, Doug, and thanks, Nolan, for that. I have to admit, I mean, this case study was definitely really interesting to me because it wasn't a perfect case study, right? I mean, when I look back at the story of how this came to being, I mean, your team initially made that decision to move to cloud in 2017, but then you wind up running into these real world issues that prevented you from just doing a switch over to the native storage services because they couldn't do what you needed, which in this case was you'd be able to bridge between NFS and CIFS and be able to handle the Linux and Windows environments together with that workflow. How did the team feel when they realized this is not going to work? Because I mean, you already made the decision to move, but then you also realized that what you had wasn't going to fit your current workflow.
Yeah, that was a real challenge. What we find in a project like this is there's so much work to do. There's always things to do. And as we worked on what we could do, we iterated and considered options. We did consider other solutions that would minimize rework. And we may have gone that way, except for the solution that came closest to meeting our needs was fairly cost prohibitive. And so fortunately, with timing, we were made aware of this other option, so we were able to, that minimized the our having to go down, spending too much time on things we didn't have control over or that we couldn't solve easily.
Okay. I guess the other thing that you brought up in your conversation, which I thought was interesting, was that option of potentially doing an application rewrite instead. But before you guys went and decided to figure out a better way of using the infrastructure, what were the main reasons you decided against doing the application rewrite?
Well, what we looked at is we actually, within emerging business, we have teams of developers. Some are dedicated to the newspaper's content production. Others helped build that were actually on other development teams within emerging business. We actually considered pooling development resources from other teams and consolidating those for this effort to rewrite. But as we looked at the code base that had been developed and built over the course of 16 years at that point, and the unknowns, oftentimes when you change something, you have unintended consequences. We found that in the end, we could likely accomplish it, but we didn't know how much time and effort that would take. And so as this option became available, it just felt like a known cost for storage that would work that was realistic. It just felt like it was a much lower risk with a higher probability of success. The other thing is refactoring. There wasn't a known time frame, and we were trying to meet time frames. We didn't want to extend contracts and such beyond what was needed, where we do incur additional expenses with that. So that coalesced nicely to help us firm up the decision to just to forklift it.
Just curious, was there any potential fear involved also? Because I mean, you guys are creating a tremendous amount of new data every day. I mean, 70 terabytes a day. That's a ton of data. If it's going to take weeks or months to implement and switch, was there also a concern in terms of how long it would take to do that conversion and switch during that uncomfortable time of launching an application and implementing it in?
There's certainly data implications. The beauty of the systems we dealt with is we have a pretty high data velocity, and so that probably didn't impact us as much. If our data set was building, we had more and more to move over, which the newspaper side, Paul on the team, dealt more with the moving of the artifacts and such. That was less of a concern for our image processing. One of our biggest concerns was just how to get that pushed across the wire with higher latency connections.
Okay.
So.
Another question I was thinking about is in terms of when you're doing the implementation, how long did it take for your team to go and test and evaluate Zadara's cloud storage to make sure it would fit the requirements? Because as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, the performance was an issue still in terms of organizations trying to take that leap. What did they have to do to help convince you that the performance was going to be able to meet the needs of this workload?
Zadara is really good at providing a means to test. Now, from our end, that did require that we have cross connects from our cloud provider to them, and of course that took some approval and some time to get that squared away. That can iterate fairly quickly, but that process probably took 2 to 3 weeks. But part of that was the approval process and such from our end. Then standing up the VPSA, becoming familiar with how to, configure it, and then working through the various settings. Okay, what settings do we set up for Linux and for Windows, and how do we get those to interoperate well, and so there was a bit of a learning curve there. So in short, that piece. We'd look at months, but a lot of that was because a lot of the operations occur in serial fashion also as we do due diligence and exploratory. Now we have the cross connects and such in place. If we needed a new VPSA, a lot of times we could do that same day, just for sense of once things are in place. But it did take a while. But a lot of that also was at times progress was held up by other priorities or demands. So that period could have been shortened had we needed that to be, and if that was all we were focusing on, probably to a matter of a week or two.
Okay, so you think it could have gone faster, but you're working with a live application, so it's not that easy to just switch and change things. Is that correct?
Absolutely. When you deal in operations, you have your planned and you have your unplanned work. Absolutely. And the unplanned oftentimes can minimize bandwidth.
You mentioned there were some process changing and other things that had to happen for this to work, and also, were there other things you needed to do? Was there like any particular employee training you had to do, or any other type of things you needed to do to make this work in your environment?
The beauty of this is a lot of there are obviously things that are going to change when we stand up new infrastructure and you're running the existing. There's going to be differences like DNS changes and stuff, but we were able to keep the name changes minimal and leverage DNS to abstract a lot of that from users and say, okay, instead of pointing to a.domain, now point to b.domain, but the application function and such were pretty much the same from the user's perspective, in large measure because a lot of the changes we were able to make, like storage and such, we can do on the back end where it's hidden from the end user. So for the changes we went through, leveraging DNS and things like that, we were able to minimize. Also, the approach we took is we had the 4 Q servers and associated processing resources. We did those one at a time. And so we were able to work with the project manager who is over that, who then is over a team of editors and works with vendors and such. So we had a single point of contact that we were able to work with that would communicate out and train their employees below them. So that for what we did, I felt it was very transparent, and we were able to maintain continuity workflow throughout that process.
Okay. Yeah, as you mentioned, I mean, Ancestry continues to evolve what you guys want to do and all the different changes you want to make in terms of the environment and potential for business value. Are there, when you look at going forward, what are the types of improvements and innovations you'd like to see in the future in terms of the cloud storage services you use today? Like, what are the type of things you think would help you transform your business even faster?
Well, there's always the given that as technology evolves, cost and performance go up, hopefully in relation, or cost goes down and you get increased performance and capacity as you go along as storage evolves. I put this question out to members on those that I work with, and one thought that they brought up that was very interesting is the concept of perhaps scaling of I/O. So you can throttle dynamically up and down based on demands and pay for what you consume. That does seem to be a compelling feature, like auto-scaling on the compute side.
Okay, so getting that type of equivalent on the storage side, so when you have the performance, you get it, but you're not paying a ridiculous amount of money when you're not actually using the storage resources.
Absolutely. That would be a domain I think there would be a lot of value in.
Okay. Doug, was there anything you wanted to add on that, or?
No. I think that's great. I think in the interest of time, what I'd like to do is sort of stitch this back up again, and thank you both, of course, for joining and Nolan for sharing your story. I mean, I look at the scale, 70 terabytes a day, moving it from this state to that state. Anybody on this call right now that has less of a load than that? Certainly, it's been proven that we can do this scope of work as a team, and we're really excited to work with anybody else that might have this kind of a data transformation task in front of them. If we go to the next couple of slides, you'll see that there's a Zadara.com, and one more slide. And if you would like to talk with any of us here at Zadara, you can basically go into Zadara.com and talk with people there. You can send emails over to our marketing teams or our sales teams at sales@Zadara.com. And we'd love to converse. We'd love to talk to you folks. This also is being recorded, so if people on your teams weren't able to make it today, but you want to kind of go through this process, certainly available to send that out to you as well. So again, right at the top of the hour, thanks so much from all the different countries that dialed in today. And we certainly do appreciate our speakers today. So with that, I'm going to turn the day back over to you folks. And thank you so much for joining this event. Bye now.